So the name of our panel is Cross-Collaboration on AI in Europe. But of course, the underlining theme is, can Europe compete on AI? So I'd like to start this session by asking a question of the audience. Kai-Fu Lee, who is the former head of Google China, wrote a book called AI Superpowers. And in that book, he said the AI race is between the US and China, and Europe will not even have a seat at the table. How many people in the audience believe that's true? Raise your hand. Okay, so we've got maybe one in the back. Okay, so today, during our panel, we are going to talk about why your belief in Europe is justified. So without further ado, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to talk about what they personally are doing in their day job to help further collaboration on AI in Europe. And then we're going to get into a discussion about the challenges, the opportunities, how Europe might differentiate itself. So let me go down the line. Let's start with you, Andreas.
Okay. So Andreas, I'm a managing director of a large innovation center and entrepreneurship center in Germany, and also head of Applied AI, which is a national initiative in Germany to accelerate the adoption of AI. And in that, obviously, there are quite a few multinational companies. So on the one hand, we help these companies to get started on the very practical questions on AI in Germany, but also then connect them across Europe. So what we did was to form a European initiative on AI with now 11 institutions in 7 countries to really work collaboratively on AI and like with very, very practical things like connect the startup ecosystem in these countries or simply to help each other. If someone develops something in one country, to help it push it also to the other countries in Europe.
So this is like in addition to what governments are doing. This is just like complementary.
Yes, it's a non-profit organization. It's in addition to like the governmental approaches, very much based on impact on output and on this like more innovative approaches from the startup ecosystem.
Okay, Evelina, let's now turn to Sweden. And you work for a private company, so talk a little bit about what you see your role as in helping Europe make its mark in AI.
Yeah, thanks. I think my mic is working, right?
It is.
Yeah, okay, good. So I work at Peltarion, which is a Swedish AI company focusing on deep learning. I would describe us as a hybrid between a startup and a scale-up. So our 2 founders have actually been building AI business solutions for about 15 years. But in 2016, and thanks to the AI Spring, we've been growing from 2 people to 80 people. And we have built a platform which makes it easier for companies to get started using AI in their businesses without having AI experts or its own infrastructure. So my role at Peltarion is leading the legal department, and I'm also involved in the AI ethics issues that we look into, both internally and externally. And as part of the collaboration, we have been looking into how we in the Nordics can collaborate with each other, not only companies, but also with governments, politicians, and academia.
Well, that's a great segue now to Rannia, who is the co-director of the Office of Artificial Intelligence in the UK. Tell us what that office does.
So I am the director for Enterprise and Technology at the Department for Business. And about 2 years ago, the UK started on a journey on putting the UK at the forefront of AI and data. Big ambition, and we decided to develop what we call the Office for Artificial Intelligence, which I'm the director for. And what it does is tries to bring together all the initiatives, all the work, our plan, our strategy for AI in the UK. So it has a domestic and international role. It has spending powers. It has the ability to design the future of where the UK government is going in AI. ambition, as I said, has been quite large, and we focus in 3 key areas for the first year. The office has been a year old, and the areas we focused on initially has been skills, very strong emphasis on building the skills of the UK population, especially high-level skills, PhDs, masters, etc. The second area of focus for us has been data. How do we share data? And we'll return back to that with some innovative models. And the third area for us has been leadership. What do we put in place to ensure that across the whole of the UK, the different organizations jointly lead and leverage best experience? So, like Sweden, we announced our AI Council, which will be chaired by Tabitha Goldstaub. Anybody knows Tabitha? Yeah? And it will be a partnership between academia, government, and the private sector to get us to the next stage, where we go next. And I'll say a little bit more about all of that when we progress.
Okay, thanks so much. So that's a great segue to Petri, because educating the population on AI is also something very dear to your heart. So please tell us about what you've been doing in Finland.
Okay, so I am Petri Myllymäki. My background job is a professor at the University of Helsinki, working in AI and machine learning. More recently, we established a Finnish Center for AI, which is kind of a part of the national AI strategy, and the idea was to have a competence cluster bringing together the best expertise in AI in the country, not only universities and research institutes, but also companies, cities, other public organizations, and so forth. And we are supposed to, our mission is to produce impact in not only in science, that's kind of easy for me as a professor, but impact in education, not only university education, but educating the whole population, and then economic and societal impact in general. So this is the mission. It sounds a little bit like what OAI is doing, but we are kind of we were founded by 2 universities and the National Research Center of Finland, so it's a little bit different. And
you're now challenging other countries in the Nordics, and you're hoping this whole movement will go even beyond Europe, right?
So the kind of in education, one of the instruments is a massive open online course called Elements of AI. And we started with the mission to educate 1% of the Finnish population. We started last year, reached the goal very early, and now we are up to 175,000 people enrolled. We are approaching 2% of the Finnish population, and we challenged just recently Sweden,
yes.
whose minister promised that Sweden will beat Finland in this friendly game, and now the even bigger challenge is to educate 1% of the world's population. This is very kind of elementary, it's kind of basic skills of AI. We also call it like AI literacy for all.
It's like playing ice hockey again, isn't it?
So let me turn now to Helen, who is COO of QuantumBlack, an advanced analytics for-profit company. So please, Helen, tell us what you're doing in your job.
Yeah, thank you very much. So QuantumBlack, as you said, is an advanced analytics firm that helps companies across sectors improve their performance through using advanced analytics. We are founded in London 10 years ago, but are now 400 people across the world. But a bulk of our work is still in Europe. And we also do quite a lot of research into AI in the UK, AI in Europe. And one of the big blockers we see, going back to your question about the US and China, is that although we're creating quite a lot of technology in Europe, we're not adopting it, diffusing it into the business community as fast as we could be. And so that's where we see ourselves helping and playing, is across Europe, helping businesses understand how they can adopt, diffuse, and use this technology to scale it in a way that can really help us drive our European economy.
So let's get now into the heart of the matter. Like, what are the challenges that we have to overcome? So we have to get businesses on board, we have to get governments on board, and we have to educate the population. So what do each of you see as the biggest challenges, and what would you recommend in terms of solving them?
I think what I see often is that there is a misunderstanding of what it means for a company to really adopt AI. I had a discussion with one of the CIOs of a car manufacturer in Germany, and he said that like AI for him is the biggest transformation challenge the company has ever faced. And this is important, that it's not just adoption of a technology, it's cultural change, it's organizational change programs, it's a new ecosystem of partners to work with. So it's a really like transformative approach from companies, and people don't understand that. And what we try to do is to like help each other to talk to each other, to define best practices, because all the companies have the same challenges. And if we actually work together, then we are faster. I mean, like if you compare us to China, to the US, they spend much more money on AI. So what we can do is to like spend the money more efficiently. And that means to really collaborate and to learn from each other. And that's what we're trying to do. And that's what actually we see as the main challenge in Europe.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think, we see those big investments by China and the US, and we see that they implement the technology faster than ever before. But in Europe, I feel that we are pretty much at a standstill. And as you say, we invest a lot of money, but it's not super clear how that money is used wisely. And also, I think that it's important that US and China see AI as a growth engine, but here we tend to... Okay. So US and China is seeing AI as a growth engine, but here we tend to focus more on the technical and ethical issues. And I think for Europe to harness AI, it will require a change of long-standing practices and assumptions. I mean, we as people, when we encounter new technology, our natural tendency is to set up an innovation lab, a future lab, which looks into the new technology for a couple of years. And that's a great way to procrastinate it. So I think what we should do is test it small scale, evaluate and iterate where it matters. AI is not a question for the IT department. It's a fundamental technology shift. And each part of the organization, not only the IT department, need to embrace it.
I'm fine. I think my mic is working. So I think I completely agree with all of this, and I will add two more areas that I think are really important. The first for us is public understanding of what AI is. I don't know how many of you have heard or have seen magazines describing AI, and the first thing you see on the front cover is Robocop. And, you know, as much as we liked it and enjoyed it back then, that's not what AI is. So educating the public, sometimes educating our own policymakers, educating ourselves, was put some very strong foundation. So really like what Finland, and of course we're watching the ice hockey game between Finland and Sweden, and we have similar plans. The second thing for us, which is very related, is talent. So it's a huge competition for talent across the world. So how we're able to not only attract talent, share, create partnerships where people can actually build new research, new capability, whether it is at a deep research level or at company level, is quite significant. And it is a big challenge when you consider how many opportunities exist, because AI spreads like fire, whereas talent doesn't really do that. It takes a long time to create that capability. And I mentioned partnerships because for me partnerships is really, really important. We have a lot of institutions in the UK from which we gather the best in order to be able to deliver. And I like to call it as we are swarming, you know. We have a lot of different bits and pieces of the AI Council. We have the UK Research and Innovation Organisation, which is hugely funded for us to do fundamental research. We have the Office for AI, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, and all of that is like, it's swarming, it's literally gathering together and bringing the best. So how we do at a large scale globally, I think will be quite important, how we build that partnership to be able to solve problems together and deliver.
Yeah, I would like to bring up one additional dimension, which is like AI is, of course, it's a technology and it's already here, but it's not ready. Actually, the current AI techniques are pretty old. I did my master's thesis on neural networks in the 80s. So, And they haven't developed, I mean, the basic principles are still the same, and the success is mostly based on other issues like increased amounts of data and computing power. But I would say that we haven't seen anything yet, so people are working fiercely to develop new type of AI technologies. So the big boom is still to come. So how to create impact based on this kind of new type of technologies? I think the traditional pipeline doesn't work, where the researchers in their ivory tower, they publish first papers, and then maybe somebody reads them and maybe applies them in some domain, and then there's some business innovation or some service innovation, and then finally at some point there's a kind of implementation. This is too slow and this doesn't work. So what we try to accomplish in the Finnish Center for AI is to bring all the players together from day one. So immediately when there's a kind of a need for a kind of new technology that kind of is not even published yet, it can start propagating through this kind of not a pipeline but more like a spiral. So that's the idea.
You're not. What a fantastic points. I feel like I've maybe sat at the wrong end of the line. But the one thing that I would kind of endorse and add is that the opportunity, kind of both from an economic and from a societal point of view in Europe and indeed the UK, is massive. So by about 2030, we could boost our economies by 20% through the proper adoption and diffusion of AI. But I think the important thing is we see it as a growth challenge. At the moment, I think a lot of companies see it as a point solution for cutting costs or making themselves more efficient. But actually, the real kind of benefit is through innovation and reimagining business models using new technologies or indeed ones that already exist. And so I think there's that challenge that we have to give to ourselves as nations, is how do you become innovative with this, not just more efficient? There you go.
So you've all brought up great points, and I have a lot of questions. So one of them is, how do we make sure that Europe? It's great that we have all these different country initiatives, and it's important that you're pulling resources together nationally. But how do we decide as a continent? How do we decide as the European Union, like, where to put our resources and our focus? What are Europe's AI strengths, and how do we focus the research and the efforts in a way that will make commercial sense? Because European research programs kind of have a bad rep as being unwieldy, taking years, and not really leading anywhere. So how do we change that dynamic, decide, okay, Europe has strengths in health data, so let's be number one in AI for health. Who's going to decide that? And then how do we harness all these different national efforts and pool them together so that we have a global solution?
I think actually that is the key question. If you compare ourselves to China, for example, or to the US, there are on the one hand large political institutions which are pushing specific topics they set. On the other hand, you have the large organizations who define their own AI agenda. If we look at Europe, we have a history of very diversified nations with a large cultural heritage, and the question is, how do we get the strength out of this diversity of the variety of our values, and also that means that potentially doing a couple of things at the same time in different places, because we are not as coordinated as, for example, the Chinese ones in this regard. So for me, the question is, yes, on the one hand, we need to find a way of how to steer and the overall efforts and produce visions for us as Europe as a whole, which on the one hand is the European Commission is pushing forward to with their high-level expert group and now the paper on trustable AI. And on the other hand, we need to simply accept that we have different national initiatives, that we have even, like in Germany, every state has its own state initiative on AI. There are large universities who have then again their own activities. So we have these very large single players in Europe, and the only thing we can do is actually try to connect them and to build ecosystems around that, and I think that's the approach to go forward.
Yeah, and I can only agree, and I think we need to convince the governments and the companies about the value and the growth that we could achieve if we work together. So if we have those regional or national initiatives, at least we should collaborate. And I also think it's important to see Europe as an ecosystem of policymakers, academia, startups, investors, and see that every party has its role, and that's important.
Oh, sorry, I don't need this. I'll pass it on to you. So I think there are a couple of things here. The first one is that we have very strong values, so both in terms of how we use our data, how we collect our data, how we grow our data, so I think that's something we shouldn't forget. I think we have a very strong ambition and quite a long track record of adopting technologies in Europe, which I think is quite important, and we do a significant amount, of course, here in the UK. And then the third thing I would say is that we have institutions that actually produce some amazing research. Our universities, our centres for excellence, our deep research. In the UK, we have 8 of the top universities in the world. So we do have strength in terms of our people, we have strength in terms of our values and the data that we collect. So I don't think we should forget that.
Regarding the competition globally, one thing that is not so often highlighted is that the scientific, AI publications in the world, if you count the number of the publications, Europe is leading. China is approaching, but USA is far behind. So kind of the expertise is here. The base is solid. Then regarding the data, we own it. The citizens own their own private data, or they can decide what to do with that. But then, public data, maybe medical data, is governed by public organizations, and then the business data is owned by European businesses. And now the big decision to make is whether we give this data away, or do we keep it to ourselves? And we have the technology to refine the data ourselves. So now it's time to make the big decisions that they decide who will win the AI arms race.
We'll come back to them. And as anyone working in this space at the moment knows, I think the trust agenda is huge and still yet pretty poorly defined. And I think Europe has a huge opportunity to really shape what it means to be responsible and trusted when it comes to AI. It's difficult, it's hard to do in the abstract, it's hard to legislate for because the space is so fast moving, but I think this is an area where we really have an opportunity to work together and actually stand out separately from either the US or China.
Maybe to add one more thing. The last time I was in Brussels to meet a commissioner of the European Commission, I think what he said is really important. He said we have one challenge in Europe. We have countries that are small, and we have countries that are small and don't know that they are small. And the last ones are the main challenges for us in Europe. And I think that what AI is now really pushing, and we had this discussion about Kai-Fu Lee, is that we now think of China, about US, and we need to think as Europe, because every country in Europe is too small to compete against China or the US, and it needs to be a European approach, and I think that's very important.
Yeah, so I'd love to get into that discussion now as because I think a lot of people would agree that we need a third way. We need an alternative to the US internet giants who have kind of proven that they do not respect data privacy and have no government oversight, and the Chinese who are using AI to control the population. So there is this opportunity in Europe where we tend to be more human-centric to develop not just legislation like GDPR, but also the actual technology to encapsulate European values and protect the common values that Europeans share, like democracy and data privacy and human rights. And that if somehow people feel like, well, there's European technology inside, that their rights are protected. And I think that could be hugely powerful as a brand if we and also maybe inspire our young people to stay here and not go to work for the Americans or the Chinese internet giants. So maybe we can expand a little bit on what would need to be done to actually make that a reality.
Yeah, I'd like to start with a point about attracting and retaining competence within Europe, because we know that the new workforce, millennials, are purpose-driven, and we can't compete with the salaries that are offered outside of Europe. But what we see in Sweden, which I think is super interesting, is that we have tech companies and AI companies that have strong values of working towards solving real-world problems. And I don't think that I qualify as a millennial, but I'm purpose-driven as well, and that was my #1 reason for joining Peltarion. So I think in order to attract and retain competence, we need an environment which allows AI companies, tech companies to grow and to actually make the employees part of solving real problems.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Regarding the fragmentation, I think this is one of the main challenges. It's challenging to try to produce Europe-wide solutions that everybody would adapt. That ideally we would do that, but we could start by maybe nationally doing individual solutions like human-centric AI in Finland and in Sweden, and show kind of an example that you can build, for example, public services based on AI this way, and then just everybody just adopts the same model. It's much faster, and kind of then we can decide, in a way we decide that let's not give the data away, we can each country keep it within Europe.
You don't. Yeah, I'm okay. I don't need. So I think there is another dimension to it, which is the goals that we set, which is very similar to the millennial issue. So we can think a lot about the data, about the talent, but if we're purpose-driven, we ought to focus on some of the big things. One of the things we've done in the UK is to start thinking about global challenges and issues that affect quite a lot of people. How we solve those global challenges has no borders in many ways. So for us, over the last couple of years, what we identified as big moonshots or big objectives to solve are things like mobility, aging population, AI, of course, and data, and clean growth. So focusing on the end goal of achieving all of those things, which are not unique to us, are not unique to Europe, and are not unique, I think, to any country, create this kind of purpose focus that we can target our attention on.
I agree.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think there's the purpose around what we're solving and then how we choose to solve them. I mean, and I can just talk from QuantumBlack's perspective. We are building both our tools and our protocols now so that they build in fairness. They make sure that they eradicate bias. We make sure that what we do is transparent. And I think the key is not to have those things as an afterthought, but build them into the ways that you are working. And we've just actually kind of launched one of our first open source tools, data pipelining tools, to share that back with the community, because I think it is hard at a governmental or regulatory level to get above and kind of ahead of all of this. So I kind of feel as practitioners, it's our job to be able to create the case law, if you like, and then share it back with the community that we're in. So that's how we're kind of trying to tackle the question of how is there a third way in terms of AI.
Yeah, if I may say, I like this discussion a lot, and maybe if we want to keep the best talents in Europe, we need strong hubs that kind of attract them. And what are these strong hubs? They have to be some kind of appealing to these best talents. There has to be a lot of other talented people, a lot of resources, data, computing power, interesting problems, and also partners. Maybe if you just want to do good science, we have a lot of scientists here. Maybe you want to have a startup, we have a process for that. Maybe you want to cure the cancer with the medical doctors, okay, go for it. And I'm not a marketing person, so this is not the way to market, but like we could have a slogan like these hubs could say that if you just want to make money, go to America, but if you want to save the humankind, stay in Europe.
You thought about that.
I think you're a marketeer, really.
I know. You are.
So actually, that's specifically what I also like about the approaches in the Scandinavian countries. So if you look at Norway, like as in Finland, as in Sweden, they really connect the AI purpose driven to the Sustainable Development Goals. So in Norway, they have the SDGs, and they actually, in all what they're doing, they always connect to at least one of those. And I think that's a very strong storyline, which really fits to what you're saying. Mm-hmm. Two other remarks on ethics and AI. So one is like we in Germany, we combine like almost all the large companies, as well as a couple of tech partners and universities. And now if you start a conversation with them on ethics in AI, the ones who really deal with it at the moment are large American tech companies. Yeah, that's pretty ironic, actually. And that's, I think, the problem. If we really want to like take and keep AI ethics in Europe, we should get going on that, because like what's happening is that other companies, other nations are actually filling also these topics with some content of what they develop and what they think it's right, and we need to start going and not just discuss on that, but really put this into practice as well. And then it comes to my third point, like if we talk about this, and if we like start regulation on these topics, we really need to see that this regulation is also thought through and then potentially enforced. So if you talk about GDPR, and we talked about privacy as one of the key values in Europe, then we shouldn't stop about just thinking on the application of AI. If a neural network is trained in China and then used in Europe with GDPR compliance, that's a competitive advantage for the Chinese companies, because they don't care about the training of the models in China. And if we like apply this regulation in Europe on training and on inference, and the globalized world, we actually just have this as a regulation for the application in Europe, and we don't care about the training in China. That's a problem and a like competitive disadvantage for us in Europe as well. So we need to think about the whole system and not just what's happening in Europe.
I think that's an excellent point. I wanted to point out a couple of things. One is, weirdly, in Brussels, when the high-level committee on AI is having these discussions right now, we've invited American tech companies in to be part of the conversation and basically kind of instill their influence on our legislation. I wonder whether that's a good idea. That's one. Two, going back to what Petri had said, I did want to point out, like, we have huge amounts of talent in AI in Europe. And if you look at Silicon Valley, I mean, the heads of AI at Facebook and many of the other companies are European. And so then the challenge is, you know, how do we keep the talent here? And maybe it's what you said, like, you know, you want to work for, you might make a better salary in the US, but if you want to work for humankind, if you want to help preserve the way of life in Europe, then come here to work on AI. But I think we still have to look at how do we ensure not only that we keep the talent here, but that when we start building world-beating companies like DeepMind, how do we make sure that they're not sold off to the Americans or the Chinese before they become, you know, as big as the giants in those countries? Rannia?
Yeah, I just want to answer a couple of things and then connect to what Andreas said. The first one is how do we keep people here? And I don't know how many of you were this morning at an excellent breakfast session, but I thought I was quite touched, and I thought it was quite amazing because it focused on diversity and women in AI. So if we want to keep people here and if we want to ensure that people see a different kind of offer, then we need to offer a diverse offer. We need to be pioneers in ensuring not only women, but the data, what the data have, how we use the data, how we develop the algorithms, how we do all of these things. We set an example, and we're leading the way. The second thing, which I thought it was also amazing, was I don't know how many of you, again, I'm plagiarizing with pride, went to Stuart Russell's lecture this morning, and Stuart was talking about ethics. And what really was amazing was that he kind of punched and finished his session by saying, we have to stop having CogX sessions that have ethics here, and they have, a Europe here or whatever. AI and ethics are one thing, and when we should talk about AI, we should talk about just AI and assume we will be ethical and assume we will have the rules and all the things we need to do. So I think it's quite important. We can change the narrative, we can change the way we talk about this, and we have the power to do it.
Sorry, can I just add about such a boring panel when everyone agrees with each other, but when it comes to AI ethics, I think it's super important that we get more use cases to actually test the ethics parameters. And I think perhaps the bigger question is it ethical not to use AI if we have the technology to save more lives?
About the scaling up issue, which is apparent in Europe. So I have been wondering, I'm not an expert in this, but like, is the only solution to kind of to create a unicorn scale of company? Since then the option seems to be that it's either American or Chinese company that buys an European company. But couldn't there be a different model to collaborate, and maybe European companies, without becoming this monolithic alphabet style of companies, maybe they could form ecosystems, and they would have their own data and some kind of share their AI and their data. This is challenging, but I think like if we can build this type of models, that would be also a kind of European way to go.
Yeah, so being the head of one of the large European innovation centers and entrepreneurship centers, a couple of words to that. In Germany, this is a recognized problem, that the companies, once they get large, they got sold to Chinese companies at the moment. That's really a challenge. Also US companies, and there is actually no large investment coming from German companies, but also not from European companies. So there are quite a lot of activities around that topic. Also on a European level, there are now some efforts to build very large venture capital funds
like a couple of billion euros to invest in tech companies across Europe. So this is a topic which has, at least in parts, been recognized as a problem, and there are now the first step to try to solve that. I still believe we will have some challenges in that because most of the money is in the US and is in China. And then we also need, from a political perspective, we need the will to create these companies within Europe and to keep them within Europe and make them large here. So we need this will, which is still not there yet, as much as it is in the US and in China.
So I take a different view in that, in some ways, in that I think that we need to have a diverse economy that has sizes, all sizes of businesses, and the more diversity and the more ability for businesses to start and grow well will eventually get us there. We have 16 unicorns that started and in the UK. London is the second city in the world for creating AI businesses, and our VC capital on AI-specific businesses in the last year went up 17%. What will happen in the future, how they will grow and what they will do, it's quite important, but it's also very important to have the right foundations and the right conditions for businesses to be able to start and then grow. So I think we should not forget that.
So I have a number of questions. One quick follow-up to what you've just said. Without getting into the politics of Brexit, I mean, you have underscored the importance of the UK in the AI field. How do the panel see UK working with the rest of Europe going forward, specifically on AI?
Well, so you're totally right if you talk about London and the unicorns in AI, which is something that most of the other countries envy you for. So I was just in Sweden to talk with RISE and with Ignite Sweden and the Swedish ministries about the startup landscape there. And it's a different picture in almost all the other countries in Europe than it is here, and specifically in London. And that's, again, like Tabitha was the moderator on our last panel with all the different European AI initiatives together in Munich in March. We had a presentation saying, okay, that's like the European landscape, and we're doing pretty well in Europe compared to China, compared to the US, and there was like in almost all cases around 30 to 50% the impact was from the UK. So it's really important to think about Europe as a whole. And for us, it's really important to consider this as a European approach, independent of the countries. I mean, we also count in Norway, Switzerland, and so it's not about the European Union, it's about Europe. And I think we actually need to look at this from a European perspective.
I mean, to your question about Brexit, and I won't go into the politics, but I do think the biggest threat that it poses to us in this instance is that it disrupts us from getting on with being great at all the things that we've been discussing. And actually, I think if we take the perspective of what's going to shape both the UK but also Europe in this space in the next 20 years or so, it's not Brexit, it's technology and it's AI and it's everything we've been talking about. And so I really think it's incumbent upon us to do the things that we've been talking about today, all of which can happen regardless of the politics, and make sure we kind of stay firm to that and not be disrupted by anything else that's going on.
Looking from the university point of view, for me it's impossible to think of Europe as a kind of a science community without UK, and I just hope that kind of nothing basically changes, at least in science.
I will not talk about Brexit in particular, but what I would like to say is that I think, Andreas, you're right. We have a very diverse European market in terms of how we start businesses, what we do, how we invest. We play a very big role in the UK, but I honestly believe that we have quite a lot of instances that will not go away of us partnering, of us learning from each other. The problems that I mentioned before do not recognize borders. So it's not that they will, we're going to hunker down and start solving things on our own. So I'm very much in the Helen camp. And the reason why myself and quite a few of us sit in panels like that and talk about these things is because it's really important for the world not to forget that we continue to do the things that need to be done. It is not just all about Brexit.
Thanks. So now I'd like to turn to the topic of data, and I want to throw two questions out, and you can feel free to answer either or both, depending on how you feel. But first, I wanted to bust this myth that China wins automatically because of their massive population and they've got data on billions of people. Because in fact, the way AI works is it's not the quantity of data, it's having enough data and having quality of data. So let's talk about the fact that Europe has enough data if it can leverage it properly. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is ownership of data and data privacy. And do we need, in order to fully realize our potential going forward, do we need to wean people off of US internet giant products and make them understand the value of their own data? So who wants to tackle those things first?
I'll go with the first if you want. So I think, when it comes to really exploiting the opportunity here, data is just, from my perspective, one part of the kind of either the opportunity or the challenge, if you like. Certainly with the businesses that we work with across Europe, you never go into a company and they say, gosh, I can't, use these technologies because we don't have enough data. I mean, that's not what you hear. We can't use these technologies because we struggle to recruit the right talent, we struggle to change the culture, we struggle with our infrastructure. There are many, many different hurdles, and it's that don't just pertain to data. So whilst I think, yes, of course, data quantity and quality is important, I by no means think it's the kind of blocker, if you like, to reaching the opportunities that we've got today. So in terms of quantity of data, that's my perspective.
I would like to echo that and also say that for us, for me, trust is a very important issue, and this is where we started off this conversation. So it's not just data, it's how you trust people who want to share data to do that in an ethical and in a way that aligns with values. So we started doing quite a lot of work, and I know we're not the only country in the concept of what we call data trusts, sharing arrangements that could potentially enable people to share data public to private, private to private, or public to public. And we are doing quite a lot of work with an organization called Open Data Institute, who is developing our first pilots on how we create these institutional arrangements that we broadly call data trusts, data commons, something that will enable us to do that and solve problems across the economy.
Yeah, so when it comes to data, I think what is key in many European countries, it is the industrial basis. And in the industrial basis, you have production data, you have research and development, experience, knowledge, and data. So it's not so much about the B2C domain, like face recognition as it is in China, or surveillance of students who are not attending school classes. Like these are some nice use cases also the Chinese are very proud of. Actually, if you're there, they talk very proud of these total surveillance use cases. But I think in Europe it's also about industrial use cases, and there data protection is not so much of an issue. It's then about sharing data, and there really the challenges come in because companies don't know how to value the data, and there is no infrastructure really in sharing these kinds of information. Once we solve this, I think that's again something we can really build on in Europe, and actually create like the AI ecosystem on the industrial knowledge and what we have here in Europe.
Yes, I completely agree that, governments can decide how they want to utilize their data. Companies can decide, they can build this kind of a sharing models and agreements, which is not easy, but kind of it's not impossible. And then talking about individuals, we are pretty much used to this I agree type of operations that we just use a service and give all our data without any compensation directly. It's kind of indirect, but it doesn't have to be like that for the rest of humanity. There could be alternatives, like we were earlier toying with an example that kind of we go to supermarket and there's a normal banana, fair trade banana. We have an option. Why don't we have options like normal search engine, fair trade search engine?
So you are a marketeer.
No, I agree with the others.
But then there is one more thing to keep in mind. I think if you look at AI applications, you have specific use cases which are totally fine because it's in your individual company or application area. And then there are a couple of other use cases which require an ecosystem. Like if you talk to Alibaba, the head of AI in Alibaba, they always talk about this city example. I don't remember the city exactly. It might be Guangzhou, where they they are very proud of not installing any new sensor, but just based on software algorithms, they went down from the fifth most crowded and polluted city in the world, down to place 50, because they connected the traffic lights with the emergency system, with a school system, everything is connected, and they somehow came to this more global optimum. In an optimization with different stakeholders working closely together. And to get this type of new applications and new optima, it's really essential to work together with lots of different individual stakeholders. And that I see much more difficult in Europe because everyone follows their own interest. And it's really hard to really get everyone on a table to come to this global optimum. You can think of healthcare. So if you want to have a really, really efficient healthcare ecosystem, there need to be kind of a vision of what we want to do, and every stakeholder needs to participate in that, and doesn't just try to protect their own empires in the ecosystem, but really work together. And in that types of use cases, the Chinese are really good at solving these, and I feel that we have really challenges in following up on those.
If I can just, a great point, and I do think that is a challenge, but as we're almost out of time, I'm going to sum up what I think are Europe's strengths. And so we've talked about the human-centric approach and how Europe has an opportunity to define itself with ethical AI. We've also talked about the role of government, and actually, one strength that Europe has compared to the United States is that because we believe in universal health care, the governments have been able to collect lots of data about the population, as opposed to the US, where everything is private and they don't have that data. So while it may not be easy, the governments do have a path forward to come out ahead by using AI with healthcare, and this could be a key differentiator for Europe. We also have a huge industrial base here in Europe, and if the companies are convinced that a real implementation, not just testing around the edges, but real implementation of AI can help them further their business, and they can really harness their industry expertise, that too could become a strength for Europe. So I'd like to end the panel by asking the audience, who here believes that Europe has a good chance to succeed in AI? Raise your hand.
Hey.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job. So please give a nice round of applause for our panel.
Thank you.